I'm Anthony Penn. I'm a professor in the Religion Department and director of the Center for African and African American Studies. Welcome to the second Rockwell lecture for the 2020-2021 academic year, sponsored by the Department of Religion at Rice University. In response to the tragic nature of our historical moment, filled with new examples of anti-Black racism, this year, the department is dedicating the Rockwell lectures to the topic of religion and Black Lives Matter. While we in the department are mindful that this lecture series was developed through a generous gift from the Rockwell Fund, it's also important to recognize all of those who labor behind the scenes. So thank you to Diana Hurd, Marcy Newton, and our chair, Elias Bamba, for all of their hard work in bringing together this year's program. I should also note that after the lecture, one of our outstanding graduate students, Deanna Daniels, will moderate a Q&A period. Please offer your questions using the Q&A feature. I am sure the lecture will push us to think more deeply about issues defining our current moment. And this is because we have with us none other than Dr. Lewis Gordon, an internationally recognized scholar who, in an interview, reminded us that we don't serve the interests of our ancestors or progeny by extinguishing the flame that inspires our love for learning. We must admit we don't know where that road will lead, and instead ask about journeys worth making, not because of what we know we will gain, but because the practice of doing exemplifies the best of what we are. Dr. Gordon is a highly regarded and celebrated Afro-Jewish philosopher, political thinker, educator, and musician. And while his experience with philosophy goes back to his childhood in Jamaica, according to Dr. Gordon, and I quote, "It was the observation that respecting people's humanity made them grow, while failing to do so makes them wither, that led to intense philosophical reflection on human potential. I loved writing throughout my childhood, and that continued during and after college. I thus decided that since I needed to pursue more intense discussion on the human being's relationship to reality, as well as questions of human potential, I should pursue a Ph.D. Dr. Gordon will go on to receive his Ph.D. in philosophy with distinction from Yale University. Currently, he is professor and head of the philosophy department at UCONN-Storrs, where his other university affiliations include Caribbean and Latinx Studies. He holds numerous visiting appointments, such as honorary professor in the unit for the Humanities at the university currently known as Rhodes in South Africa, where he was formerly the Nelson Mandela Distinguished Visiting Chair in Political and International Studies. Dr. Gordon's research interests include Africana philosophy, philosophy of existence, phenomenology, social and political philosophy, philosophy of culture, race and racism, aesthetics, philosophy of education, philosophy of science and technology, and philosophy of human sciences. He is the award-winning author of many books, including Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism, Her Majesty's Other Children, and an introduction to Africana philosophy. Dr. Gordon is widely recognized for his service in the profession, including his role as honorary president of the Global Center for Advanced Studies and as former president of the Caribbean Philosophical Association, for which he now serves as its chairperson of awards and global collaborations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lewis Gordon. Dr. Gordon, you have to turn on your mic.
My apologies. Thank you. I begin with a simple act, so as many know, I always speak without my shoes on, but in a forum like this, the act of acknowledging the ancestors requires a little more. So I included a short drumming chant. I begin by saying Halito, and Halito is Choctaw for hello. It's important in this country for us to remember that this is a society built on settlements. It's a settler society, but the indigenous people are not gone. And although we're here in a context where we're talking about racism and the question of Black Lives Matter, we should remember that every day, whether it's in the reservations in Arizona or all the way through to New England, or the fact that many of the indigenous people are in the urban centers, they may not be seen, but they are here. I also mentioned Machia Vanakam. Some of you may not know that part of my ancestry is Tamil Indian. And I also say Hotep, which goes all the way back to ancient Africa in the language of Beredeter. And I'll say Shalom, with which many of you are familiar. And since it was recently the High Holy Days, some people call it the High Holidays among Jews. And as Professor Pin mentioned, I'm also Jewish. I say Lashana Tova to many of you out there. And of course, right now, and especially Texas, we know this, with the treatment of what's going on to Latinx peoples. Buenos dias, and we should remember that there's so much for us to do. And Ujambo, which is Swahili, to hello to everyone. Last time I was at Rice, when I was in Rice Village, I had the good fortune of speaking there. And one of the things I loved about my visit was that every second was a moment of surprise. And I'd like us to bear that in mind, because as we know, when it comes to educational institutions, there's so many ways in which, under the current situation, they're being maligned and misunderstood. But one of the aspects, when we think about education, the importance of it for a flourishing life, the very fact in that Rice Village is not simply a group of buildings, but it's also trees and varieties of diverse communities. It's a testament to what has been that spark that has transformed our species when we first inscribed a symbol and we began to think about what it means to live together. I have friends, colleagues at Rice University, so I'd like to begin by mentioning their names. There's Elias Bongba, who has worked very hard for this series. There is the well-esteemed, wonderful, well-known Anthony Pin, who is graciously moderating this event. There's Stephen Crowell, who's symbolically a brother of mine because we share a mentor, the great Maurice Nathanson, whose picture is in my office and every day reminds me of what an example of a caring, loving teacher is. There's also Diana Hurd, who has worked so hard to put this together, and many of you in the community, some of whom I've not met. I begin also by extending my condolences. And when I say condolences, it's because, look, it's a fact. We are living in extraordinary times, and not extraordinary times as a blip in history. We're living in times in which people are dying daily in numbers that could have been avoided. But as we know, it's a situation that's connected to the reason for this lecture today. And many people don't understand what is going on in the lives of those families as they lose their loved ones. And I'm not talking only about COVID-19, although the situation with COVID-19 is one in which there's a whole structure that has transformed this question of loss and death. But I'm also talking about the ongoing wars. I'm also talking about the insensitivity to life on this planet. And what many people don't understand when we lose a loved one is that every one of us experience what it is to encounter the loss of what is irreplaceable. Part one. Part one, there are many things I could say about my work, and many people who read it will see that there's a vast literature, but as Professor Pinn mentioned, I came to this work of professional intellectual activity with a genuine question, which is the question of human potential and the question of the dynamics that impede its growth. So in a nutshell, a lot of my work is about the human being's relationship to reality and the many ways we offer of evading it. You'll see me drinking water quite a bit. And that's because in March, I was one of those people who suffered from COVID-19. And a lot of people don't realize the severity of this disease. There are people who are out there calling it, for instance, a hoax. But I could tell you, and I'll return to it in a moment, the question of I could tell you about the severity of this illness. I have to drink a lot of water mainly because you're perpetually thirsty, even though for me, that's going on 7 months ago. Now, there's a book I just wrote that's coming out later this year called On Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization. And when we think about freedom, justice, and decolonization, we should also understand that means what animates it, what stimulates such reflections are the opposites. The opposites are practices of enslavement and other kinds of unfreedom, injustice. And if you're going to talk about decolonization, you got to talk about colonization. The point, though, is that all three are interconnected. So if we come back to the question of the context of this lecture and what has led to the community at Rice to decide to make this the theme, we all know about the COVID-19 pandemic. And the COVID-19 pandemic is not only an historical and epidemiological reality, it's also an allegory that captures the moment. Because it's an allegory in the sense that if you look at COVID-19, it's something that ultimately is a disease created by the novel coronavirus, and a virus is a set of molecules vampirically in search of DNA. And when we think about it at that level, this vampiric exploitation of our biomes, we also know that it has created a situation in which many people have to be put on quarantine. And quarantining is a situation that fosters a sense of disbelief, hoax, invisibility. This is because although many people suffer from the horrific dimensions of COVID-19, this disease, the suffering happens behind closed doors. And for many people, if they can't see it, it doesn't exist. This means that there's a profound invisibility of people suffering, even when they go into the hospitals, because all of the very brave medical workers have to be covered all over, and the patients have to be covered all over, and they're in ventilators and all of these things. It means even in that context, as they look like mummified creatures, many people are not actually seeing the scale, the havoc wrought upon these people at the level of mind, or if we will, spirit and body. And this quarantining then is a circumstance where more people, as they begin to be locked in a situation such as the one we're in now, where we have to use a technological device through which to articulate our sociality, our communication. Under those circumstances, more people begin to reflect upon isolation. Now, I like to say straight up, I don't like the term social distance. I prefer to say physical distance. And the reason is social distance is a clearly neoliberal way of talking about this issue. It's a way of talking about this issue linked to a history of the very logic of dehumanization that got us into a lot of this crap in the first place. I prefer to say physical distance, but through the technologies of communication, we're socially close. And this is a way of using these technologies that many of the creators may not have anticipated. Because we already know that a lot of this stuff is used to spy on us, used to get data on us, used to treat us in a reductive way simply as consumers, and how they could cybernetically manage us. However, the human spirit needs sociality, needs communication. And so many of us are transforming these technologies creatively, and we're beginning to find ways to communicate that opens new possibilities. But at the same time, as I said, there are converging pandemics. And when I think about my own situation with this disease, what struck me was at its height when I saw the white light, when in the midst of suffering you cannot imagine, I was able to, for a moment, enjoy the visit of ancestors. You could imagine what it's like to see your dead mother, to see your dead grandmother, to see all those wonderful people you miss in a room with you. And of course, with such high fevers, the hallucinations create an experience almost of bliss. And I remember how happy I was. And you know what's funny about being visited by ancestors? They tell jokes. And I remembered as I was being comforted by this, I was afraid to say something that at times when I would be visited in dreams, I would say. And this is the part of me as an intellectual, as a person who has written psychoanalysis, something I understood, which is that although I knew it was my subconscious at work with these hallucinations, when I had past experiences where I would see a deceased loved one, I would make a remark, "It's a shame you're dead." And the deceased loved one would get upset and say, "Now, why you gotta say that?" And they would leave. And I would try to apologize, but they would leave. But in the midst of that experience, that hallucination, when I said, "It's so sad that you're dead," they didn't leave. And at that moment, you could imagine, I began to wonder, did I just take my last breath? And this thing about breath, that is the allegory of the moment. Because you see, we're actually witnessing through these technologies, whether they're smartphones, whether they're going online in the internet, we're witnessing, brought out into the open, the ramifications of the convergence of the pandemics of colonialism, racism, the radicalization of dehumanization, and environmental degradation. Because the consequences of all of these is the culmination of a loss of breath. We already know this when we think about the conditions that led to the circumstances we have today. Because although we see the horrific situation of a knee on the neck of a human being for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, the cruelty, the apathy as well involved in this, what haunts many of us is how much we don't ordinarily see. What we know deep down is that a lot of the comforts that people are able to live through are built on the asphyxiation of so many over centuries. So the context we're in right now is a context in which many pundits are saying, are we heading towards fascism? Hey, look, we're already in fascism. Fascism is the ongoing culmination of the misanthropic logic of racism. And this requires, this logic, misinformation and disinformation to support itself. And that's because this kind of phenomenon is a phenomenon that's ultimately a phenomenon that has to misrepresent reality in order to bring itself supposedly outside. It's the constant covering of our eyes. It's the characteristic of an ongoing practice for nearly 500 years. When I mentioned, for instance, the indigenous people of this country, it was not meant simply as an act of courtesy, because every one of them could tell you that they have been struggling to breathe for 500 years. If we talk about the question of Black people in this country and what was wreaked upon Black people across the globe from colonialism, it has been an ongoing struggle, whether it was from the hulls of the slave ships in the Middle Passage, to the ongoing butchering of people in the Congo for the sake of getting rubber. These are situations in which people found themselves struggling to breathe. And one of the hallmarks of the ongoing violence of these practices in the United States, as many of us know, is lynching. And what is lynching but to break your neck and to have you gasping, trying to breathe as your life withers away under that cruel, cruel sentence. A lot of that is brought into focus and was transformed in the 20th century. And there's something about fascism that many people don't know. Because as I mentioned these earlier incidents, a lot of people think about fascism at the point at which was named fascism, whether we think about Mussolini's Italy, whether we think about Hitler's Germany, whether we think about Franco's Spain. But we have an awful tendency to think things aren't real until they're done to white people, until they're done to Europeans. Aimé Césaire, in his discourse on colonialism, called it Hitlerism. But what we fail to understand is that the warm-up for what happened in Nazi Germany was in Namibia. That's what the Germans were doing on the continent of Africa. And the inspiration for the Germans in World War II, for the Italians in World War II, and what eventually, right after World War II, became apartheid South Africa, was actually the United States of America, with its eugenics practices, its segregation, the whole practices of racism, and sad to say to our neighbors up north, Canada as well. So one of the things that's crucial is for us to understand that history. Now, most efforts to discuss racism, they suffer from a fundamental problem. Because you see, we're dominated by a very reductive way of looking at these issues. We want to reduce it to something else. We want to know if racism is exclusively about class. Is racism exclusively about an individual moral evil? Is racism exclusively about some kind of fear of the other, that kind of stuff? But the problem with that way of thinking is that it's simplistic, it's naive, and it leads to misrepresentation. This meeting, for instance, this particular talk is organized through the Department of Religion at Rice and in consolidation with the Department of Philosophy. And that is a very noteworthy example of what it means to begin to do it right. Now, why do I say this? And I say this because, you see, many people don't understand that a lot of the foundations of racism was in religion. The term race, for instance, is from the term reza. And the term reza, which goes back to Andalusia, into Iberian Spain, back into the Middle Ages with Portugal and Spain, referred to breeds of dogs, horses, and Jews and Moors. And right now, it'd take us too far for me to get into the theo-naturalism that's involved in that way of thinking. But the basic premise was that to be fully human was to be a Christian. And think about that, because there are people in this country today in parts of the world who still adhere to that kind of thinking, that to be fully human is to be a member of their religion. However, as we know, the conflicts in that part of the world took to the seas. And that anti-Afro-Islamic, Moors, Afro-Islam, anti-Afro-Islamic view, anti-Jewish view, took to the seas in a context in which there was suddenly a circumstance of profound wealth, profound riches. And this led to a convergence of religion, economy, because so much money was being made that stimulated the quest for enslavement, shifting political forces, and the exacerbation of ways of thinking that led to what we call today the Christian right. But in the midst of all those was also a change understanding of what it is to be a human being. And that change understanding took the form of idolatry, a form of hubris, a form of arrogance. There's another book I'm writing that will come out next year called Fear of Black Consciousness. And in the beginning of that book, I talk a little about malignant narcissism. And if you go and look at the Mayo Clinic's symptoms for malignant narcissism, look at that. You will find that every single symptom that's marked by the Mayo Clinic maps on neatly to white supremacy. White supremacy is all about we're the best, we're better than everybody else. White supremacy is about if anything challenges our hegemony, whites that is, then it becomes white victimization. It goes on, the list just goes on, and it's a form of attack on reality, which I mentioned earlier. And in the midst of this, there are other ways in which when we try to talk about racism, we, in a word, distort the issue. In this country, for instance, we forget that from the moment a child is born, that child is being taught how to evade talking about racism while being taught to be racist. And I'm not saying it's exclusively in the United States. One problem in the United States is we tend to talk about issues as if the way we deal with them is the only dimension of them. These are issues being struggled with in Brazil. There are issues being struggled with in Colombia, in Argentina, in Canada. They're being struggled with in the Netherlands. They're being struggled with in the UK. They're still being struggled with in South Africa. They're being struggled with all over South Asia, because there's a group of people, as we know, in South Asia called the Dalits, and they're the Black untouchables of South Asia. So when I'm speaking right now, it's not from a perspective of saying we are the worst or others are the worst. This problem, like the pandemic, is a global problem. But one of the ways in which we learn to evade talking about these issues is through the valorization of moralism versus addressing the political reality. And this may sound strange to Americans, but what many Americans don't realize is that the United States is a profoundly anti-political society. It's a society in which to bring up politics, to say you're even talking politics, is to treat you as if you're using dirty language. You're speaking a dirty word. And this creates a very big problem, because although it's fine for many people to talk about these issues in moralistic terms, the reality is that racism is a political phenomenon. And I'm going to speak a little bit about why that is so. The question of dealing with it as a political phenomenon can go back to when I began to talk about the multiple convergences that led to the world we live in. And the world we live in today is a world that's dominated by liberal and neoliberal models of how to look at a human being. Now, when I say this, I don't mean liberal the way people say it in everyday language. I mean it in the way that in philosophical language, the historical structuring of the world that shifted from the way ancient peoples through early medieval people tried to think about how to live together. If I use Greeks as an example, there was politia, or if I use ancient Egyptians in Metaneter, in the language of Metaneter, there was a way of talking about people in terms of, for instance, ka and potis. And what these come down to is understanding the power that human beings have to create a world in which we cultivate and make our humanity grow. In that world, in those ways of looking at things, politics is good. Because you see, without the ability to work things out politically, we're left in a realm of violence. Are left in a world of opposition in the form of erasing the life of others. But when we begin to talk about these, what happened from the period of the 16th to 17th century onward was a shift from talking about human flourishing and an effort to look at society in ways that were dominated more by ideas of security and acquisition of wealth. And this began to lead to a logic in which a kind of self-interested, selfish model of what it is to be a human being began to develop. And within it, a shift emerged from a time in which human beings could be in markets where they could meet and talk ideas and learn about each other and grow, into a fetishized idol called the market. And that fetishized idol then took the form of what all idols take. And this is connected to the work of Anthony Pinn, who is moderating this discussion. And that is the form of what's called theodicy. Theodicy is when one tries to account for the completeness, the goodness, the omnipotence, the power of God in the face of evil, injustice, and other forms of malfeasance. And many of you who are from religious backgrounds know at some point you may have an argument with your parent about God. And you may say, you know, if God exists, why is there so much evil in the world? Why is there so much injustice? And from antiquity to the Middle Ages, from the time, for instance, of St. Augustine, there were two classic answers. One classic answer is, who the hell are you to question God? You're a finite being. What are you talking about? So in that version, there's something wrong with you, not God. Then there's another version that says God, out of an act of love, gave us free will, and we screwed it up. The main thing in both instances is to take God off the hook. God's integrity is maintained. But in a world in which we turn away from God and we begin to create idolatry out of an economy, or we create out of a society or a system of knowledge, that theodicy makes it something wrong with us if we question the society, if we question the economy, if we question the system. And what that does is the same logic. Instead of saying or addressing the problems of the society or the system, it attacks you, the questioner. Who the hell are you to challenge the society? And it leads to very bland, very, very problematic forms of fetishizing of the structures of power that be. And this is one of the things that one of the elements that play a crucial role in the development of fascism. Because you see, what animates fascism is actually a certain way of responding to crises, particularly from groups we can call the right. Now, in this country, we look at things in a simple-minded way. We talk about the right and the left all the time, and the concepts right and left actually come out of the French Parliament. It came out of the fact that the people who are Republicanists, the people who are defending the idea of equality under the law, sat on the left side of Parliament, and the people who were supporting the monarchy sat on the right. And the idea of monarchy, all the way from the way you could look in philosophical literature all the way back to a defender of the monarchists, such as in the Anglo tradition, Thomas Hobbes, monarchists always rationalize themselves on the grounds of security and law and order. So if you get that's one historic way, but that has been transformed to the point where it's become almost like gang warfare. But if we think about the right and the left in a very different way, if we think of the right and the left today as an attitude to crises, and what a crisis is a situation in which you're compelled to make a decision, right? It's from the ancient word krenain, which means to decide, to choose. Some people hate to be in situations of having to make decisions. And so the impetus to the right is to say that the situation of having to make a decision means something has gone wrong, and then they turn to the past and cherry pick it and create a valorization of tradition, law, rules, and order, and argue that the past was better. And this is one of the reasons why we have things on the right, as in this country, like Make America Great Again, as if America in the past was perfect, or the United States in the past was perfect. But the thing about all turns to right and to the right for law and order, they tend to take the form of saying that any form of dissent, any form of challenge to the society is a source of disorder, and they should be eliminated. And what results is a form of attack on difference. And if that goes to the extreme, even those within the right are not right enough. And that's why right-wingism often pushes itself to the extreme, and the extreme is fascism. And under fascism, the idea is that no difference should be tolerated for the sake of supposed security, supposed order. And that's why all fascists promise that they're going to give you permanent security. And that's why they love to build monuments. That's why there's a valorization in antiquity of stone. And that's why even in this country right now, many of us know these Confederate monuments they're all going all over the United States, they were not actually historical. They were built, most of them, as a response to the civil rights movement to scare, to terrorize Black people and to terrorize many other people with the idea that their effort to exercise their democratic, their political rights will be squashed. But the idea of monuments with stone, what many people forget about monuments is monuments are also grave markers. They represent the illusion, the fetish of the idea of permanence, even though someone has died. And that's why there are so many, we're in danger of, as a society, when we make monuments out of objects, out of things that are created by human beings, whether they're constitutions, whether they are universities or institutions, or whether they're social institutions, or whether they're economies. And this form of monumentalism, linked also to the etymology of monuments, in manera, from which you get monstrum, from which you get monster, are forms of warnings. So it's no accident when we see monuments that there is a form of haunting, a form of assertion of the dead involved. Now, you may wonder, again, to save time, I'm just going to summarize. You may wonder about the left. Well, you see, leftism comes from a very basic insight. Leftism comes from an insight of saying, well, if you look to the past, what people in the past were constantly trying to do was to make things better. So that means there is no perfect past. What's happening in the crisis in the moment is that we, this generation, faces the challenge of trying to make the society better. And that means then returning to the past is just to return to old problems. Now, of course, this means then to look to the future, but it's not that neat and it's not that easy, because some people who are involved in leftism try to look for a future, but they're animated for the desire to create a form of eternity. And so ironically, that leftism has as its underpinning a form of right-wingism as its ideal. There's another form of leftism that's linked to a more complicated question, which is the relationship of liberty to freedom. And many in the United States today don't think about the distinction between liberty and freedom. But the short version is this: liberty is an absence of constraint. Simply because you lack constraint doesn't mean you have the right to do anything you want. That would be called license. And what some people long for was a time when some people had license. For instance, when we think of lynchings, those were mobs who gathered together and viciously dissected a human being in public view, posed for pictures where all the perpetrators were there. Law enforcement would sit on the side and watch. That is an act of license. And in that situation, that when we think in that way, that sort of a romanticization of liberty is not a proper expression of freedom. Because you see, freedom is about responsibility. And one of the things when we think of responsibility, even when we use languages of privilege, for instance, it's a privilege for me to speak with you right now. Privileges and responsibility are about doing what is right and honorable. No one has a privilege to murder, rape, and maim, but you can have a license to do it. Those police officers who are doing that to not only Black people and indigenous peoples, but there are others who are not caught on camera. Those are people who think having a badge on them does not make them law enforcers. They think it makes them the law. And what we know, if you think you are the law, you have made yourself sovereign, which paradoxically means you are above the law. All people who believe they have license assert that they're above the law. And what white supremacy does is to try to designate as a category of people, those people who are supposedly, at least in regard to the people they dominate, they're above the law. So we come then to this crucial issue. If we're talking about responsibility, if, for instance, you are now cultivating a humane environment, all responsibility is linked to what it is to build homes, to build ways of living together, to live ethically. And this is where politics comes in. Because, see, politics is fundamentally about power. But many people misunderstand power. They think power is domination. That's the coercive model that we've inherited from people such as Thomas Hobbes. But many people don't reflect about what power is. And so we have this horrible situation today where there are people, anyone who seeks power is treated as coercive. And this is why there's a left who's almost allergic to power. But if we reflect upon power, power is the ability to make things happen with access to the conditions of doing so. Some people use that ability and the conditions to block other people from exercising their ability and having access to those conditions. That is called disempowerment. Racism, sexism, homophobia, colonialism, all those are examples of the use of power for the purpose of disempowering others. So logically, if racism is a practice of disempowerment, then to develop anti-racism is a practice of empowerment. And that is fundamentally what is feared in a racist society. We know in this society, for instance, when you say the words Black power, there are people who just lose it because this society is cultivated, it's been built upon the idea that Black people are not to have power. Indigenous peoples are not to have power, and there's a long list of people who are structurally not to have power. But if we're going to respond to it, politics makes no sense without power. And one of the unfortunate developments recently in the rhetoric of how people talk and debate in the United States is they valorize moralism, which comes back to the individual, instead of looking at the political issue. If the political issue is disempowerment, then an individual being moral is not going to do it unless that individual is a god. What happens often in American discourse, in US discourses on racism, is to try to find, say, a white person, to make that white person feel as guilty and moralistically ashamed as possible. And that gives a temporary sense of a will to power for the non-white person. But at the end of it, the white person goes back to a structure intact that's premised upon white supremacy. And the Black or brown person goes back to a system intact that's designed for his or her disempowerment. So this means that as we go through this game, we fail to address that this is fundamentally a political problem, and that political responsibility is different from moral responsibility. Moral responsibility is about me or you individually, what I should do. But political responsibility is always about us. It's always about the nation, the country. One of the difficulties of political responsibility is that it doesn't matter if you individually vote one way or another. The fact is, those who are in power, everyone in the society, has the responsibility for their actions. And so if we come to the question of governing, which is different from politics, and that's what we confuse in the society, it means that we could learn a lot, especially in a context like this one, from very important religious examples in the past. As it was recently the high holy days in Judaism, I'm going to bring up Moses, because what many people don't understand about the story of Moses is that with all the great things Moses did, with all the ways in Judaism God supported Moses and the Jewish people, what many forget is Moses did not enter the promised land. In fact, Moses was able to go up on a mountain, the mountain on which he would die, and look into the promised land, but he did not enter it. And I read this as a political allegory, because could you imagine trying to build a society if you had to deal with Moses? The moment the next generation, who is not dealing with the situation that led them to the promised land, and they want to be critical of a position of Moses, Moses could just hold up the tablets. How do you challenge Moses? And this is one of the fundamental insights, because you see, we do need law and order. We do need those things, but we also need courage, liberty, freedom. We need to challenge, we need to transform, we need to build. And the political insight there is that that every generation, as Frantz Fanon would put it, face a mission to betray or fulfill. So I'm come now to my concluding remark that comes directly into one of the themes of this series, which is Black Lives Matter. Because you see, the picture I just painted is rather bleak. We face a situation of fascist elites who have devoted energy to the disempowering of people across the globe, for the constellation of power at the level of economic resources and military resources, to the point where they are waging war against the people. There is something profoundly wrong in a society when a response to people going out to protest, to exercise their speech, is to beat them, gas them, and even develop heat rays to burn them. Even in circumstances where they may be destroying property, we must remember that property can be replaced, but lives cannot. And to do that for the sake of holding up a Bible is a disgrace to what that text represents. But there's even more going on when we begin to think about this, because you see, that willingness to put police involved in violence, not law enforcement, but violence. When we face this, the situation puts the citizens of society, and puts those who even are not citizens, puts every human being in a situation to have to make a decision to die to do what's right. So in the midst of that, when the standards are that high for you simply to get out into the world and assert the right to live in a society that's democratic, what is clear is that what we're witnessing in the struggle against racism is that the response, the violence of the response against the struggle for what is right, makes it clear that the fight against racism is not simply a fight for the lives of Black people. It is also a fight for democracy. And that's why my position, as some people speak cynically about the many whites who are putting their lives on the line, and the many brown people, and the many different people, even when people think about the Jews that are not of color, if we think about white Jews and many of those who are out there, I commend them, because they understand that this is a fight to live in a society of decency and respect for humanity. So I'm going to now conclude by bringing up this very complicated issue. The complicated issue is, how in the world then can we do anything under these circumstances? Well, I'm going to speak in terms of the relationship of Alicia Garza, the woman who tweeted Black Lives Matter, and the woman Patrisse Cullors and Opal Tometi, who, these are queer Black women who worked with her, and they created the Black Lives. They were the ones who set the framework for the Black Lives movement. Because if you think about their political reality, if we say they created it, we fetishize them with idolatry as well. Black Lives movement is growing because it's connected to the reality that we're living in at a time in which the implements of power are being used against humanity. But I want to illustrate it through an example of what seemed like impossible odds. And the example I want to bring up is their connection to a woman by the name of Harriet Bailey. Now, Harriet Bailey was a woman who was born a slave and died a slave. Harriet Bailey, in the early 19th century, had a child. And as we know, many people don't understand not only the true story of the horrors of enslavement, and I have to tell many of you, there are people who are trying to expunge from the history books the actual stories of enslavement and the actual stories of racism, including with this absurd decree of the President of the United States recently. But I got to tell you this, most historians who go through the archives who look at enslavement end up having to get therapy, because the version you get, however horrific it may seem to you, is the sanitized version. The depths of cruelty and enslavement are such that many historians, when they go to look at the archives, have to read even closer because the pages are covered with tears of previous historians who read through them. Under that brutal circumstance, as property, Harriet Bailey had no right, she had no, under that system, way to defend her right to her body. So the master impregnated her and she had a child. And in that world, the child, for a period, is sent usually to a wet nurse or to an older enslaved woman with a group of children who prepare them to the point at which they can be brought into the cruelty of ongoing labor, the laborious aspects of enslavement. Well, when that child was about 7 years old, her child was brought to the master's home. She, Harriet Bailey, she learned about this, and she lived 12 miles away. Discovering this woman, who was a field slave, after working from dawn till sunset, took whatever little food she had and walked through Maryland, through dealing with the possibilities of wild animals or people who could randomly stop her and do anything they would like to her as a potential escaped slave, to go to that child, spend time with that child, and to give that child some of her food, which meant she would return hungry. There was a time she went where there was a cook who was chastising the child, and she defended the child against that cook. And then, as she did this for 6 months, she died. Now, when she died, the child continued and developed a certain sensibility, because you see, that child began to understand what it is to be valued outside of the framework of the system of slavery. In the system of slavery, he was told he was only valuable as a piece of property, and he was only valuable to the extent to which he could either be sold or his labor could be used. But this woman introduced into his life a different understanding of value, and that's the value of love. And this child, with this understanding of love, this child now understood that there was a different kind of value. And he then went on and eventually stood up and fought against one of his slaves, a person to whom he was rented, which was a reverend, by the way, by the name of Covey. And then afterward, when he escaped, he could have just kept going and just hid away and say, I'm out of it. I have my liberty. I don't have to deal with this. Yet he became an abolitionist, and he went to and he began to speak. And at a certain point, because he wrote a book and his whereabouts was known, he lectured in Ireland and England, and that child was eventually there was a fundraise to purchase him and hand him his freedom, or rather his liberty. And within that framework, you have to think of the irony, the fact that his book, because there was already a copyright law with Congress, his book had more rights than he. But at the point at which he had papers for his liberty, he could have also stopped, but he continued to fight for the rights of others. And this is because of an important insight. Because you see, if that child simply thought about the fact that he was loved, he could have imagined he was better than others. But you see, that child, when he escaped, changed his name from Bailey. His first name was Frederick, and the name he changed it to was Douglass. He became Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass, as you know, fought for the rights of enslaved people. He was an abolitionist. He fought for women's rights. But if I stop the story there, you would miss the entire point of this story. Because you see, the point of this story is that the story is not really about Frederick Douglass. This is a story about Harriet Bailey. Because you see, what made Douglass revolutionary, what made him fight for the freedom of others, is because what the world he was in was a world that said being loved by an enslaved Black woman was not valuable. That to be loved by her, she could not be a source of value. So he, in valuing her love, learned to value her humanity. And that's what connected him to the humanities of others and the struggle to be waged. That story is a story of radical love. Why did this woman do this? The profound issue is, how was she even able to act? She didn't know this child would respect her love. She didn't know this child would love her. Her actions came out of a commitment built on love. And I bring this up because you see, love and commitment, when we are trying to fight for freedom, is the understanding that the struggle is not for you or for me. Harriet Bailey didn't do that for her. She understood that the child had to develop and become a living human being of dignity and freedom. And if we go back to Alicia Garza, when she tweeted Black Lives Matter, when she was interviewed, remember what she said? She said it was a love letter. She wasn't saying that other people's lives didn't matter. She was saying the bleakness, the brutality, what was going on, the constant effort to tell Black people our lives didn't matter. She, this queer Black woman, and the group of Black women who joined her, and the communities who joined them, were saying structurally in their political actions, you are valuable, you are loved, you're irreplaceable. And so as we today face a similar situation, we are now the generation where people could look back and ask, if we do what we're to do, how were they able to act? And what we should consider is the courage, the fidelity, the commitment, and the radical love to act in a way where, although we may not be the ones who enter the promised land, what we should understand is for those generations to come, if we act as we should, and they may not even be people we could recognize, they may not even be people we would like, it's for them to be able to look back at us and say, thank God they acted. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. That was a wonderful talk, just simply wonderful. So we're just going to get into the questions from the chat. The first one, can you explain critical race theory, specifically why and how people are so confused about it in public discourses?
Great. Could we have all the questions? Because one of the things is I'm really, the questions that, or a bunch of them that could be posed, because I think if I don't get to answer all of them, the questions will help the audience to reflect. I don't think this should be the meeting. The idea is for it to continue beyond this encounter.
Sure, we can make them available as they're coming in. So they're still coming in right now. So we can start with that one and I will post all the rest of them.
Okay. The thing about critical race theory that many people don't understand, and there, even among themselves, there's debate among critical race theorists. Most people today, when they talk about critical race theory, they're talking about really an area from critical legal studies. But there's another critical race theory that preceded critical legal studies. And that's a critical race theory that goes all the way back to the 19th century. That's from people such as Anthony Fermat in Haiti, people such as Franz Boas, who was a German Jewish physicist who came to the United States, became a cultural anthropologist in the 19th century and founded the School of Anthropology, of Cultural Anthropology at Columbia University. And of course, W.B. Du Bois is an example. W.B. Du Bois was the actual person who founded American sociology. That's an example. And we could also think of Anna Julia Cooper, the work she did in A Voice from the South. And there are many examples. The basic insight of critical race theory comes down to an understanding of something connected to what I said earlier. And that is that one, race didn't always exist. People were racialized, but many people treat race and racism as if they're like monuments in stone. The second thing is that critical race theory is premised of, there are many groups in critical race theory. There are those who come from different intellectual and philosophical and political camps. But part of some of the things I was talking about is connected to what I call bad faith. And bad faith is an insight in which we understand that people can lie to themselves. One of the strange things about racism is that racism goes against human beings. But in the content of a racist belief is the assertion that another human being is not really a human being. So the bad faith is identifying human communities and denying their humanity. Critical race theory examines how is it possible for people to develop systems of structural inequality, degradation, the misrepresentation of people, and at the same time, not take responsibility for them and assert them as if they are truths. And in fact, bad faith is a retreat into displeasing falsehood and a flight or an evasion from displeasing truths. So critical race theory is an effort to bring into what we call double consciousness, the dialectical critique of one of the biggest fears of racism and all fascism, and that is truth. Critical race theory is to bring the truth, not only of the humanity of the people discriminated against, but of the dangers to our own, to everybody's humanity in a society in which we degrade other human beings. Now, there's a lot more academic elements of critical race theory, but that's a start. And it makes sense that in a time when the country has turned to fascism, that it would fight against critical race theory because it's in the midst of a war against truth. Just like in January, when the Senate had an opportunity to block the course of fascism in this country by actually responding with the truth, they failed. And similarly, as we're facing situations right now we could see what's happening with the Supreme Court that's related to critical race theory, because the idea of erasing, for instance, the possibility not only of a Jewish judge, I'm talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but also the fact that there's a hypocrisy and a complete illusion of principles involved in what's happening in the society. The legal end of critical race theory, the critical legal theorists would point out that we're dealing with a situation of a society with double standards. So critical race theory also tries to make us understand that there's a problem in a society that makes people into problems, instead of examining the problems human beings face in the society.
Thank you. We have another question. It's about radical love. They're asking, how do we consider love as a technique of, how do we consider love as a technique of mechanism of resistance? How can communities who effectively love within so that they understand their value translate this knowing to effective change against the systems that nevertheless render them loveless and invaluable?
Okay, and is there another question?
There is a question, yes. The shift from individualism and the focus on moralism to discussions of politics and power seems incredibly important, but the shift is made impossible if we evade our relationship to reality. How would you advise shifting discourses to feature our human relationship to reality?
Thank you for both questions, because they're both related. So those are wonderful questions. Okay, and by the way, people tend to, I talk a lot about bad faith. People tend today to be, in a perfunctory way, say people raise good questions, and sad to say they're often lying, but these are genuinely good questions. Okay. The first thing, of course, is the problem when we turn to radical individualism is we make it all about ourselves, and we cultivate little populations of narcissists. Narcissistic models of love come down to this: I love you because you're like me. That's what narcissistic love is. And you could see how all racisms are narcissistic forms of love, because they're premised on the idea that you could only love yourself and people who are the most similar to you. The problem is that defies reality. We know that human beings cannot only love people who are different from themselves, because if this were really true, for instance, you could never have if you think about it, there can never be a man who loves a woman. It means, the way some people think in ancient thought, that men could only love men or women could only love women. Or it could get to the point where human beings could never fall in love with somebody outside of their community. Or even more, you could not have the fact that there are human beings who love creatures that are not human beings. So the capacity of love for human beings could get to the point where we could realize there could never be the ability even to love God, if that were true. Because no matter how much you may try, you may have a connection. In Judaism, we take the responsibility for the ethical face of God. Other traditions, they may try to say the image of God, which is a whole lot of debate. But one thing every human being knows: we are not God. And so the fact of the matter is that if you can't even love God, it's connected to radical difference. So one of the things that we have to bear in mind about radical love, okay, and why it's different, and why non-narcissistic models of love should be considered, is that it is connected to reality, you see? Because you see, political reality, there's no such thing as a person who is involved in political leadership who can get to know everybody personally who's under her or his jurisdiction. Every political action has an impact on the life of someone in relation to whom that person is anonymous. So that means there has to be a capacity to love through difference. But what makes it even more significant, and this is a philosophical point, which is that, you see, one of the things we've inherited is this idea that reality must be reduced to things. It's all about things. And that's usually in a logic and philosophy we call ontology, which is about beings. And this fetishizing of beings and things often leads to another concept, which is known as pleonexia. It's a big word, but it comes down to the love of things, the acquisition of things. However, there's always been, not only in what we call the Western tradition, but in Eastern traditions and many traditions, the realization that things, being, that's only a part of reality. In fact, the Japanese thinker Kaiji Nishitani, puts it this way. One problem with ontology or with being is that some people forget that being covers reality. Now that sounds very cryptic, very complicated. But you see, the thing about human reality is that we are the creatures who stand out. We appear. And because we're able to appear, that difference of appearance, that is what creates the upsurge of responsibility and what's to be done, of decisions, of questions to be made. But it also brings us in touch with a profound humility. Because you see, at that moment, as we stand out, the whole history of our species at the level of debate has been about those who hate standing out. They hate the fact that we were born, that we left the womb, that suddenly we are responsible for the lives we live in. We're even responsible for meaning. Everything we do when we reach to others produce new forms of meaning, etc. And in that framework, then, what we learn, and this is what occasions fear and trembling, is that reality is always greater than we are. And the greatness of reality also creates a form of terror, but not terror in the terrorist sense. And that is the realization that every creative act has a responsibility. Mary Shelley, the 19-year-old who wrote Frankenstein, was brilliant in her understanding that Victor Frankenstein, when he created the creature, he looked in the eyes of the creature and he fled because he wanted narcissistically to see himself. And had he the proper love to love the creature as something other than himself, he would have actually set the condition to the cultivation of a nonviolent relation to reality. But instead, the creature was isolated, demeaned, and the consequences were severe. Well, similarly, colonialism was premised upon narcissistic models of love, with the idea that the only way to belong is to be the mimetic imitation of the colonizer. But the problem with that is that would yoke and block the freedom of others. That's why I told the Moses story, because although Moses was a liberator, if he yoked and blocked the subsequent generations' ability to live their freedom, he would have been a colonizer. And so radical love is about not the effort to reproduce narcissistically the self. Radical love is about enjoying, expressing, and supporting the freedom, the dignity of others.
Okay. We have a couple more questions, so I'll just throw these three at you.
Okay.
First, would you agree with the premise that genuine, not token, anti-racist actions have to be anti-capitalist as well? Additionally, we have a question that says, what seems clear in the current situation is not just that people have the right to not choose to tolerate difference, but also that the U.S. Commander-in-Chief is a type of witch finder, a type of charismatic person who proposes to save the social order by eliminating all the witches, here meaning non-white, non-Christian persons, at least those who step out of line. He fans the flames of difference to back the lie that witches are present because he needs witches to exist to consolidate his dominance. The stand of the witch finder against political action, in your sense, that is acting in the interest of the collective as a whole, is so strong, and his effect on his followers so galvanizing, that peaceful protesters for democracy now must knowingly run the risk of vehicular homicide, which he has suggested is okay if you feel threatened. Of course, I'm not suggesting we run a special risk in protesting. Many protesters run similar or greater risk globally. But my question is, do you think it's possible? Additionally, In my Africana Studies class, we've discussed the Malcolm X quote that says, "You can't hate the roots without hating the tree," which he explains how there is an internal hatred in the Black community due to the demonization of Africa. My question is, how do we start cherishing our Black roots and stop questioning our self-worth due to the color of our skin? How do we deteriorate and tear away this internal hatred for our roots in the Black community?
More wonderful questions. Thank you. Well, with regard to the first one of the things we should think about is we should avoid false dilemmas. And false dilemmas come from reductive thinking. One of the ways, whenever we have all or nothing way of arguing, we create straw men, you see? So one of the problems is, when I talked about the market for instance, the issue is the fetishizing of the market instead of the pluralism of markets, you see? And capitalism is a form of fetishizing of the market. So capitalism is a problem. But a lot of people create a false dilemma to say that if you get rid of capitalism, you've gotten rid of all markets, all other ways of living in the world. Yet human beings have had markets going back 150,000 years. Archaeological evidence shows that human beings have always had ways of trading. The thing was, those old markets were very humane markets, human situations. One of the reasons ideas traveled across our species in primordial times was because different groups of human beings would meet each other, share with each other, and grow with each other. They entered markets. Sometimes meeting at a market went on for weeks, mainly because that's how they got news. That's how they learned things. But that was very human. The Euro-modern capitalist model of markets was against the idea of markets being human. And so they replaced the question of the communicative practice, the sharing of markets, with the model of profit, where profit supersedes the humanity of others, to the point where there were people fetishizing the market so much that there were actually people in this country trying to plead with young people and many other people with pre-existing conditions to die so they could make profits. That is obscene. So the question with capitalism is very straightforward. The question with capitalism is that we need to rethink how we think economies, period, whether it's socialism, capitalism, or any other kind. Because again, we need to think about them beyond the reductive models and try to think about what it is to have economies that actually serve for people and the dignity and integrity of life on this planet. We treat capitalism and socialism as if they're closed books, like there's a rapprochement, you know, or they're dug in trenches. But who says that's the entire story? It's bizarre that we're giving prizes in economics to people who are not actually thinking in a more creative way about how we even rethink the very concept of an economy. And so we need to go beyond those. If we come now to the question of the fascism, not only of our president. See, it's easier to focus on Donald Trump, but Mitch McConnell has done some extraordinarily horrific things in terms of cultivating the situation. And there are many others because of, even if some cases it's bullying, whether it's around cowardice, we could get through a long list of why that happens. I highly recommend that many of you look at a text by Ortega y Gasset. He was a Spanish philosopher and statesman, writing at the time of similar to what we are facing now. And what Ortega y Gasset pointed out is that he talked about massism. And it is a revolt of what's called little men or little consciousness. You see, one of the things we know is bravadoism. People have to beat their chests and constantly tell you how big and how great they are and so forth. People like that, we know, are not people of greatness, strength, and integrity. It's their smallness that makes them have to shout so loud to everybody that they're supposedly big. And the thing about massism is that massism is actually an enemy of democracy. This is one of the reasons why we're going through a fight for democracy. Because you see, the thing about all democracies is that democracies are also about enabling what individuals have to offer to flourish in the democracy. And in any society where people cultivate their talents, they're going to be people who we call experts or artists or whatever language we have for them, but also people who have other gifts, people who are good caregivers, good nurturers. It's impossible to distinguish yourself in a society in any way that doesn't make you a minority. If you're an excellent plumber, you become the plumber many people seek, and that distinguishes you. Massism is premised upon ressentiment. It tells you the response of the resentful individual is not how wonderful it is that you're contributing to the society with something special. How wonderful it is that there are people doing everything from picking grapes to making sure their people could get home safely. The person of resentment says, don't celebrate it unless it's me. You see the narcissism? The resentment is, if it's all about me, the resentful person is not interested in what to contribute to the society. The resentful person rejects the celebration of achievements if it's not about her or him. And this is one of the reasons why there's a profound hatred of education, of anybody who could manifest using their mind. You know, one of the greatest gifts Donald Trump gave his followers was election night 2016. Because you see, those people were so elated that they could look at the people who are smarter than them, more educated than them, more creative than them, kinder than them, and stick their middle finger up at them and say, F you. They're so grateful for that gift of the ability to harm the people they hate, that no matter how much his actions and the coterie of aiders and abettors that have wrecked their lives and made the world worse for them, that has transpired over the past 4 years, there's a reason why he needs to remind them of that night. Because people of resentment want to cling to a moment of glory in which they're able to degrade others. People without resentment don't have to be the ones celebrated. There's a reason why you have the concept of what's called gracious victors. A gracious victor says, even though they have won, it's time to think about the fact that we live together. I think one of the best examples of gracious victory is what we're seeing right now in the NBA. The way almost everything the NBA is doing with the bubble, thinking about the welfare of others, the players, the solidarity, thinking about the world around them, they're a better model of how to think about this society than what we're seeing being exhibited by individuals who, when they are in power, abuse it. If we come to the last question, I'm going to answer the last question in a way that may surprise you. W.B. Du Bois, at the turn of the 20th century, invited that German Jewish physicist and cultural anthropologist Franz Boas, I mentioned earlier, to come and speak at Atlanta University, historical Black university, college university. And he invited him because he was an outspoken critic of racism, what in today we'll call a critical race theorist. And when he invited Franz Boas said to him, I don't want to talk about race in this address, because he says, Black students live racism every day. They know about how that racism exists. They know they're human beings. They know they're being misrepresented. Franz Boas said, I want to talk about African history. And at that moment, Du Bois said, say what? Remember, Du Bois was an historian. Now, the Du Bois we know today, this Du Bois we're talking about was a very different Du Bois at this stage in his life, right? His late 30s into early 40s. And Franz Boas said, yeah, I want to talk about African history. And he said, what do you mean? Because you see, the Black bourgeoisie, petty bourgeoisie, the Black intelligentsia, many of them, despite their efforts to fight for the dignity of Black people, did believe the rhetoric that somehow Africa was a place of savages, inferior people, and enslavement brought Black people over into the new world, so to speak, and created the virtues of Anglo civilization, European civilization. And they, with their degrees, Du Bois was from Harvard, there were others who were from Columbia, different places, they are going to be the talented representative to pull up this backward people into civilization and etc. And Franz Boas said, what are you talking about? You know, white supremacy at the time he was talking about was very recent. Humanity and that, you know, human beings, Homo sapiens, have been around more than a few 100,000 years. Most of those few 100,000 years was on the continent of Africa. Right now, we're making all this big noise about European civilization and all kinds of stuff, and there's so much misrepresentation of history. He said, look, most of the great achievements that led to us to have everything from culture to language, all kinds of things, happen in Africa. And it's a form of epistemic violence. It's a form of effort to brainwash and demean Black people, to make Black people believe that in Africa there was no history, and for us to erase all those achievements that are achievements shared by all of humanity. I have an exercise when I teach my students, which is, if we were to take Black people out of history, what would their morning look like? And everything from being able to turn on a light bulb, the filament to a light bulb, to use a toilet, all the way through to a lot of the medicines we have, to even the way we think of our agriculture, all the way through to many of the things we have today, all the way from even our substances from beer to bread were developed on the African continent. And all the way through the smelting of iron, bronze, all of these things. So one of the things that Boas pointed out, and the thing we have to understand, is many of us have a very false understanding of those people who were enslaved and brought to, and kidnapped, enslaved, and brought to these shores. We tend to think of them as brute labor running in the bush, not knowing what the hell they were doing. These were skilled labor. These were people who knew everything from irrigation to medicines, and that is why the plantations that had enslaved people directly from Africa tended to prosper, because Europe did not have the knowledge of the kind of environmental conditions that you have in North America, Central America, and South America. A lot of Europe is fed by warm waters from the Gulf Sea that create very different climatic conditions, even for farming. And so a lot of the prosperity, what enabled our species not to disappear, but actually get to the point where we're 8 billion strong, came out of the knowledge we are able to benefit from Africa. And many people need to learn that history. It's not only violence against Black people, but it's violence against all humanity to have a misrepresentation of our history. What would this country be without the history, without the understandings offered by the indigenous populations? What would we be without a lot of Asia, or what we get from West Asia with the Middle East, from language to the very way we deal with medicine? So one of the importance of actually having history, remember I said the greatest enemy of fascism, of racism, is truth. The problem is there are people fighting for us to have textbooks and conceptions of knowledge that actually misinform, disinform us, and make us susceptible to the mechanisms of false realities. So it means then, I've always said the best defense of Black studies, the best defense of African studies, is not the narcissistic model of saying we need to see Black people and see Africans. The best defense is that in those is truth. Many of us don't understand why we should have women's studies. Well, because many women don't know that some of the men they study in history were actually historical women who were rewritten in history as men. A lot of the inventions we have in the United States, a lot of enslaved people couldn't own patents. Eli Whitney didn't invent the cotton gin. It was his slave who did. But slaves couldn't own the patents. And so there are a lot of white masters in history who were dumb as spit and couldn't invent anything. But they're the ones who are part of the edifice of the false history of white supremacy. And if we even go back to women, the fact of the matter is we're on a computer right now, many of us. But most women don't know that the person who developed the algorithm for the computer was Ada Lovelace. This was a woman. And in the process of that set the conditions, not only for that, but even later on, a lot of us don't realize that wireless technology was also developed by a woman. It's a woman who was talked about simply for her beauty because she was an actor. She was a Jewish actor by the name of Addie Lamar. But Anna Lamar was secretly working for the US government, the military, developing special technologies that enable us, many of you right now, I'm plugged into an Ethernet cable, which is why I don't have any glitches, but those of you who are using wireless, that woman was a crucial part of what you have today. And so one of the things we need, the best defense of a humane world is to cultivate also truth. And once you find yourself needing to hide the truth to maintain your so-called legitimacy, you've already lost the battle. The reason right now the GOP, the Trump administration, and many of the forces, not just there, but Bolsonaro's in Brazil, Modi in India, and what we're seeing happening also in the UK and many parts of the world, their biggest enemy is truth, because ultimately they cannot come in the public and put out into the open their position, and the people could actually look at them and honestly say, thank God you are acting. What we need to do is stop them. And so the fact of the matter is, when we are engaged in dealing with this kind of issue, it's unfortunate, it is sad, it is difficult, but these are people of violence. And it is sad to say that the standards have to be very high, because today to fight for humanity, for democracy, and for truth requires extraordinary courage.
Thank you. We have 3 last questions. The first one is a follow-up to similar to the earlier question, and it's, do you think it's possible to counter the witch finder? If so, how? Next, we have, how do you view the moral rhetoric around voting vis-a-vis the latent narcissism of white supremacy you discussed? It seems there's a paradox where both parties historically represent white supremacy and domination, but that the account of voting out of the current administration is posed as an imperative gesture of political solidarity. The third question is, Alice Walker's definition of womanism says not a separatist except periodically for health. Do you see any possibility in turning towards pessimism or nihilism in this current moment?
Okay. Well, the first thing is, the reason I told the Harriet Bailey story was to illustrate the point about commitment. The problem we have is too many of us want to know the outcomes before we act. Harriet Bailey had no way of knowing the outcome. What related to the last question, the big problem with all forms of pessimism is they don't realize they're the other side of optimism, but both are part of the same coin. They both are premised on the idea of having the knowledge, almost a guarantee for the action. But the issue is not about how do you know in advance. The issue is you have to ask yourself, what are you committed to? What are your commitments? And once the commitment is there, your action, if you understand it's not for you or about you, could set the conditions for things you cannot predict will come, which gets to my point about the parties. My point here is not to demonize the GOP or to romanticize the Democrats, is to eradicate the language of false equivalence. All parties are human-created institutions, which means that they go through an ongoing process in which they could change, and if they refuse to, they become monuments or become obsolescent. And so the task is to create the conditions linked to the way I talked about power, the conditions that enable people to be able to build what would be viable futures. So the real issue is not about whether we can predict the outcomes. And pessimism is a highly problematic position because pessimism is a form of retreat from action. Pessimism is a form of denial, and pessimism, if you are pessimistic enough, you get locked into yourself and you become the form of individualized, self-absorbed narcissist that is the problem that got us here in the first place. So pessimism is not the answer. The problem with optimism is its naivety. Optimism really tries to give you guarantees when the truth is the optimist doesn't know. So I'm going to say frankly to you, I do not know. I do not know what the outcome will be. I only know that I'm committed to doing my part and hope that others will do their part for the actions to come. The issue is to remember that none of us is a God. None of us is God. The call is not for us to be able to do something like that, which is like a magical force that will change the world. The call is for us to do something. Because like Harriet Bailey, who did her something, or Douglas, who did his something, or Harriet Jacobs, who did her something, or Tula in Curacao, who did his something, or Mary Seacole, who did her something, or Sojourner Truth. In other words, the list of those who did their something is very long. But what's the connection of all those people is they were doing their something in a world that told them their actions didn't matter. What they did didn't matter. And what we should understand is that everyone's action matters. And the fact is, although some people may be misguided, the task is for you to get up and do, given your commitments, what is to be done. But here's why love is important. Because if what you think is to be done is to eradicate the lives of others, then you have now abrogated, you have now abdicated the very condition for the possibility of love. It doesn't mean that you do not fight or get involved in the struggle, but we don't want to think of fighting the way we think of economies, in a very reductive way. We need to understand that there are multiple tasks, and one of the things that would hurt us most is to find ourselves on our deathbed saying, I could have acted and I failed to do so.
Thank you. We're going to turn it over to Dr. Anthony Penn.
Thank you very much for everybody who asked the questions, and for those I know who had to continue, because I know there's another forum afterwards. Since this is recorded, thank you for your time in participating in this forum.
Well, Dr. Gordon, on behalf of the Department of Religion and all those gathered today, thank you for your so very insightful lecture and your generous and informative response to the questions. We very much appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us. Stay alert and stay safe.
And very quickly, keep safe, healthy, and despite the desperate, dire times, do find moments of joy, because it reminds you of your humanity. Thank you.